Okay, this video from, of course, I am Cornet, and this is who we are in a positive assertion rather than simply being limited to say what we're not. Some people say they are Calvinists, some people say they're Arminian, that is, they are Arminian, others say they're Molinist, whatever. And it wouldn't matter what ecclesiastical background. Some people are all types of denominations and claim to be one or some or all of each one of those. So we just simply say, I am Cornet. This topic is about the ethics in exposition. Ethics in exposition. And this is just to cover ethics, merely referring to values, right and wrong. For example, some people say things, I'm not sure that I can agree with them, but they use terms like this book, old book now. It's a very old book. Not sure how old it was. Back in 1970, and it wasn't used much, of course, because it's in good shape. But it calls things false doctrines. We refer to fallible religious constructs first and admit that they're fallible, and then we evaluate the fallible elements. And that's ethical. That's right thing to do. Everyone would do well to evaluate fallible religious constructs. But to use the word false or wrong preemptively seems to be perhaps it charges emotionally the conversation so that you can't really have one. People aren't you don't run into a lot of people who are composed about their beliefs. In this little book, Power in the Pulpit, How to Prepare and Deliver Expository Sermons, it has a checklist on page 31. Not that you need to read that, but it just says that when you prepare an expository sermon, there's a checklist. It must be based upon a passage in the Bible. The actual meaning of the passage must be found. The meaning must be related to the immediate and general context. The eternal, timeless truths in the passage must be elucidated. The truths must be gathered around a compelling theme. The main divisions of the sermon must be drawn from the structure of the passage itself. And then every possible method to apply the truths must be utilized, and then the hearers must be called to obey those truths and to live them out in daily life. So I would say that would be a great ethical expression of the right way to approach the text. One thing I would like to include that I've learned recently, very recently, that first, understanding something to be fallible and to be religious and to be merely a construct seems to be elusive to a lot of people. Of course, I use the pyramid, this little triangle, as the symbol of that. And then to compare it to the scriptures, that is, to evaluate something, and then to identify the elements, the fallible elements. For example, give example, something very popular. I like to use it because it comes and goes, but it's fading out now. People's interest is not as emotional anymore. But a class was being taught by an advocate, that is, someone who was advocating a fallible religious construct. He was positive about it. He was for it. You might say he supported it. But he made a statement that he said, I might be wrong. He might be wrong. Well, that's a large statement. It was commendable because the people in the class were saying how they appreciated him saying that he might be wrong about his fallible religious construct. And then when I was in the discussion, wanting to learn and actually trusting people who say they might be wrong and believing that it is a commendable acknowledgement, it just seems to be a little late, because if you might be wrong, but you might want to think of that before you start supporting or advocating something. So I just asked the question, what might be wrong about it? Well, they didn't know, and nor has he to this date ever expressed that. So I never said something was wrong about what he was supporting. I would say that it would be less than ideal on the topic of ethics to not know about something you're advocating. That is, to know that it might be wrong, but then not know the things that might be wrong about it. So I did a lesson for the class, and I was really shocked that being ethical and being willing to evaluate a fallible religious construct, which is what we do at Ion Koine, and that, for example, if it is Calvinism, someone says they're a Calvinist, well, first, as an advocate of it, first thing is are they aware that it's fallible? And that's just a yes or a no. And that is, do they understand that it is fallible? And then, of course, number two, are they aware, do they have knowledge of the fallible elements? Now, if not, then they are passing this thing along called Calvinism, for example. They're passing it on, just handing it off to the next generation, to the next generation, and it just grows and builds. Now there's such a thing as a hyper version, a high version, a moderate version, and a low version. There's certain points in it that some people will expand upon and emphasize, and at others they'll de-emphasize. But where's the evaluation? And that's why we talk about ethics, for example. We'll cover this, we'll come back to this in just a moment. But the topic that really had a lot of students in our church rather excited was this simple text about what people call the rapture. And it literally says, thereupon we ourselves, and anyone that reads this common language knows these things. This is the living ones. And then here's the again. The ones remaining around. This is a word adverb. It's simultaneously. There we go, simultaneously. This is a word, this little word here is together with. It's a preposition. And this is just a personal pronoun, them. And then it says, will be, future passive tense, will be seized away. And there's clouds. Into or unto, it's really not this lesson to go over that, but a meeting of the Lord into air. Now this is I didn't finish the text, but for example, what's missing when people begin to advocate pre-trib rapture, mid-trib rapture, post-trib rapture? What's missing is people can advocate it, but that doesn't mean you're evaluating it. And if you're going to expose something, which would be a good thing to understand, if you're going to expose the elements, for example, the elements in a fallible religious construct. So the teacher who was an advocate of, let's say, the pre-trib, and don't worry, if you're still in a denomination that doesn't allow you to evaluate the scriptures, we would invite you to come out, because as members of a called out body of baptized believers who are agreed together for the purpose of carrying out the Great Commission, We don't have any types of superimposed denominational or religious dogmas that we must advocate. We're free from that. So he was an advocate, but he had not evaluated it. So if there was a right or a wrongness, it's not about this. This isn't wrong. That's a strange word to use, to say it's wrong to teach pre-trib. It's right to say pre-trib is a fallible religious construct. It's right to evaluate it. And then it's very right, that is ethical, to exposit the fallible elements. And you'll find people aren't near as charged. People don't get their emotions aroused. I've heard people advocate pre-trib or mid-trib or post-trib, and the basis of advocacy was telling how horrible it was or how wrong it was, someone else's position. I would rather be trained as I was on how to evaluate these things. It's more ethical in exposition. And then, of course, the Koine text, its common language is just, I don't know, it's painfully wordy. But when people leave out things like simultaneously, together with, then you can see why people can separate what they call a rapture, which is actually a verb here, the seized away. No noun appears. And people will go to the Latin Vulgate and show you where the word rapturo is, which is great. They just don't notice, because they're not looking for it, they don't notice the adverb simul is in that Latin text. So while they're out looking for source material to support what they advocate, they overlook what's actually missing. And what's missing here is the simultaneity or simultaneous nature of this sees away. So that's just one thing, but I don't know what the negative reaction is all about, except the person probably hasn't been trained in exposition, hasn't been trained to know the difference between, let's say, a confession of faith, which is a fallible construct, for example. It's not inspired. All confessions are subjected or subordinate to the Scriptures. So let's look at this one. In number one, it's unethical. Let's say this. It's unethical for us, for example, at I Am Koine. We consider it unethical to advocate that which we refuse to evaluate. I mean, really, no one wants to kid themselves about what they believe, and it's certainly not for a teacher of the Bible to want to kid other people just to get them to buy into what we prefer. Number two, for us, ethics and exposition include the willingness to differentiate between a fallible religious construct and let's just say the Bible, for example, the Scriptures. And that's something that we find very much necessary, because a lot of people are so frustrated. And you can talk with people who even attend seminaries and say, hey, what about Calvinism? And they kind of push back, or they don't want to engage it, or they don't have time for it. Or you say something about Arminianism and they push back or are uncomfortable, or they then say, hey, have you heard about Molinism? And again, really, we're talking about the text, the Koine common text that's so wordy that a person really, we can't really overlook with a language so specific the elements that are so obviously missing today. For example, if we were talking about the fallible religious construct, well, just pre-trib, for example, let me go ahead and review that. Pre-trib, then first thing you'd say is one of the fallible elements, something that as another person said, might be wrong, I would just say a fallible element, something that's missing, would be that little word, a little adverb. And simultaneously. Now that would slow people down quite a bit just to understand that. Then there's something called hyper-apocalyptics, where someone who was an advocate of post-trib rapture, which I do not advocate it, he was saying that everyone that didn't take the mark of the beast would be killed, and that's when I said, well, who would be here to be raptured, seized away? So he had to mediate his extreme hyper-apocalyptics. So that's just the type of things we can get into, the extremes. And then, for example, if you haven't ever evaluated it, you already know why. None of us seem to have a need to evaluate what we personally prefer. And preferences are mentioned all through the Bible. It's a Greek word where we get the word heresy, not damnable heresy, as people call things. People say horrible things about advocates of fallible religious constructs, but even famous expositors advocate Calvinism in the name of their still saying they're an expository preacher. Strange as it might sound, is they can really advocate Calvinism, and on the other hand say we really need to be good expositors, and yet no one notices that the person who is such a champion of expository preaching has never evaluated his fallible religious construct that he's still willing to advocate. So expository preaching is simply a phrase, apparently, because it doesn't necessarily include evaluation. Because when you actually evaluate a fallible religious construct, you find out, for example, in that grand argument where you'll hear people argue about free will, and does the Bible teach it or not, you'll notice that the fallible religious constructs that you're given are libertarianism, compatibilism, and now this form called Molinism. But what you may not notice is while you're busy picking between the two and jumping here maybe and coming back over here, whatever all that is, you may not notice that evaluation of all these, you'll notice that within none of these is a definition, a working definition of free will from the Bible. Now, where I fellowship and people who train me, Hermeneutics 101 is first define your term from the Bible. So this is where causal agency, where a person is a causal agent. And we've covered it a million times, but one more time won't hurt in this context of ethics in exposition. For example, Genesis 2:21 says God caused a deep sleep upon Adam. That's in the English text, but in Genesis 15:6, the English text translators omitted where it says he caused himself to believe the Lord, referring to Abram, and they left that out, omitted it. And that could be biased because the translators of the KJV version were Calvinist, of course, and anyone wants to check that out, that's easy. But that's not a right or wrong thing again. It just, causal agency is very much what the Bible teaches about a person. And then the purpose of the gospel in John 20:31, remembering causal agent or agency. When we come to our Bible and it says the purpose of the gospel was in order that you all might, that is, the purpose of the gospel to be written down was in order that you all might deliberately, that's in the Koine language, a deliberative subjunctive, that you might deliberately cause yourselves, cause coming from the Hebrew, cause yourselves to believe, punctular, that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing, continuing there, you might have life in his name. And of course 1 John 5:1 says that the new birth precedes this continuation of a person deliberately causing himself to keep on believing. That person's been first fathered out from God and remains for. Now you won't learn that from advocates of Calvinism. You'll only learn that from people who adhere to the ethical approach in exposition to include evaluation. So when you evaluate a fallible religious construct like libertarianism or compatibilism or Molinism, And, well, this is a philosophical construct. But when you evaluate it, you'll notice that what's missing is one of the first things in hermeneutics. Even in the exposition text we just read about expository sermons, the meaning needs to come from the Bible. So, we can go down a long list, but these fallible religious constructs are a better way. We don't find it necessary at Koine to charge people, indict people, condemn people with right or wrong because they, let's say, advocate something. Most of us all start out as advocates, and we become prime positively or negatively based upon the advocacy of a thing. And that's why we were warned early by teachers who were teaching us how to search the scriptures and evaluate the text, that people will advocate something just for the purpose of getting people to come after them. And that would be where someone invents the high ground, for example. You're teaching the Bible, and all of a sudden you notice someone comes along and, hey, we got something better, and they calls people to come over here, and they pretend that they've got something better and don't believe those horrible things. Well, the horrible things aren't in the Bible. There's no such thing as hyper-apocalyptics that people teach. The book of Revelation doesn't frighten believers. It should, as when properly taught, it demonstrates very well the righteous judgment of God against evil, and that he'll consummate the age as he has all throughout all the ages, and he'll bring evil to its rightful end and just end. So whoever's turned the apocalypse into something negative for believers has certainly turned it on its head, because the writer of the book said, even so come quickly, and he didn't qualify the statement. He said, even so, in light of what he's seen and has been revealed to him, he was ready. So two main things is we don't want to advocate that which we refuse to evaluate. And I recommend we go ahead and evaluate first and then exposit it, and you never have to advocate it. And then always differentiate between a fallible religious construct. So if you're teaching someone and you say, we're going to talk about libertarianism today, whatever that means, then make sure you tell them it's a fallible religious construct. And yes, I call that all these constructs Egyptianity, because people seem to just embrace them blindly without even caring whether they've evaluated it or not. And then they begin to advocate it, and then they say horrible things about people who don't go along, which appears by their actions, which never lie, that their first interest seems to trump the first interest that we all should have, is what does the scriptures actually say. And Jesus dealt with that with people who would say one thing, but the scriptures would have something totally different written down. If we're all evaluating fallible religious constructs, for example, I taught preterism, historicism, futurism, and the spiritual view of the book of Revelation, and then taught the good folks there what was fallible about each one, and how that nowhere in history is something so partitioned. Everything's not past, and everything's not historical. There was actually a time when the book was written. Everything's not future. And it's when people come up with these arbitrary partitions that they create a tension that's not found in the scriptures, especially knowing that Christians have been here for 2,000 years throughout the time the book was written. Even Christians were the author of the book. And so we were there at the present time. We've been there throughout all of our history, and it's our future, and all the words are spirit to us. So this is enough for ethics and exposition. Just a good example of what can happen if you begin to advocate something before you ever evaluate it. And if you don't evaluate it according and compare it to the scriptures, you will imply to your hearer or your reader that what you're advocating is the scripture. And that would be something, a conclusion that the person might not be able to live with later when they evaluate for themselves. Not everyone would be so trained. A lot of people lose heart. We're warned in the letters to the church in Corinth, our conduct with reference to being seen eating meat offered to an idol and what it would do to a weaker brother who had come out of idolatry and was then devastated, literally the word's destroyed in the Greek text, by our actions. And if we're advocating something, later someone evaluates it, it would cause them to start questioning the advocate of it. Is the person touting this not even aware of the fallible elements in it, which is a problem for the person who's learning? Or is the person aware of it and would rather advocate something for the purpose of how many people does it draw to him or her? So that's it. These two are enough, and a lot is in this. But this is a topic called ethics in exposition.